Hey there, vinyl community. What makes a $600 classical record reissue? What goes into something like that? What kind of company puts it out? What is a record like that like to feel, to play, to listen to? Those are some questions I'm going to answer today because I have a very special record here to talk about. More after the break. A few weeks ago, Danny K, who you may know as Sonic Flare on YouTube, I'll provide a link to his channel down here, reached out to me and asked if I'd be interested in taking a listen to a really interesting new record, or relatively recent record. And that is this right here. It's a reissue by the French record company of a mono 1958 recording of the Debussy piano preludes by French pianist Marcelle Meyer. I say reissue, but it's a little different than a normal reissue. It's a little more than a normal reissue. This is a record that is still available. It sells for 600 euros, or about $650, and it's by a label called the French Record Company. When I first heard about this and learned about it and saw Danny's video on it, this very much to me felt like another record label that's very, very infamous in the vinyl community, and that's the Electric Recording Company. But the more I kind of dug on this record label and this product in particular, the more I felt like it was similar but also very different than that record company. While when Electric Recording Company, when ERC first started, their first titles were classical titles. And it did interest me, but at the same time it didn't interest me because I'm not going to buy a multi-$100 reissue of a classical record. It's just not something that is in my normal pure view. But it did interest me because they were reissuing very, very rare classical recordings. They were reissuing, chamber music Columbia SAX records that on their own sold for $2,000, $3,000 on the secondary market. And they were doing facsimile reissues of those very, very rare, oftentimes UK chamber music recordings. And those were the first kind of ERC titles to come out. And they were selling those records for a few $100, $300, $400, $500, depending on when it was and when the title was. And that's very, very expensive and not something I would spend on a single record. But for people that were after those particular recordings, well, that's 25% the cost of hunting down an original. And they were doing facsimile jackets and facsimile reissues from the original analog tape using a not exact replica, but very similar replica mastering chain to what would have been used back then. And so those records I kind of understood. Now, when ERC got into more, shall we say, standard titles, things like The Doors, things like Love, where there were already lots and lots of different high-quality reissues available, and they were charging, many hundreds of dollars for those records, that I do understand the criticism of that. It's one thing when you have kind of a rare product and you're doing a boutique facsimile reproduction of that product, but it's another when you're taking something that is more readily available in the market and trying to justify the cost of your boutique reproduction. And that brings us to where this label fits in. This is not ERC. This is a very different record company that has some similarities to ERC, but does some things in a very distinct way. This is a reissue by the French Record Company, a record label out of France, headed up, founded by, run by a very interesting conductor and musicologist named Jean-Marc Harari. And I spoke with Jean-Marc about this record to try to get an idea of what he was going for with this reissue and what exactly makes this so special and what makes it, in his eyes, worth the price. So a little bit about this record. This is the first recording issued by the French Record Company. It is a recording of Book 1 and 2 Debussy Preludes along with the images by the French pianist Marcelle Meyer. Marcelle Meyer is a very interesting figure in the piano, and I want to talk a little bit about her later, but first I'm going to give an overview of what this is. This is a facsimile of a record that was never released. And that's what makes this a little different than the your electric recording company type reissues. Is those are facsimile reissues of records that were released and do exist and you can buy on the secondary market. This recording was recorded in 1956 and 1957 in mono by a French record label called Discophile Français. There's going to be a lot of French words in this review, and I am not a great French speaker, so I'm going to try my best. Hang with me, guys. This was a recording that was in the catalog for Discophile Français that was planned on a 1958 release. 1956, 1957 mono recording. It was planned to come out in 1958. But in 1958, Discophile Français went bankrupt, and they were reorganized and later emerged as a slightly different label, but the company essentially went out of business for a short period. And that is probably why this recording was never released. Jean-Marc with his team went back to the original jacket design that was on releases from this label at this time, completely redesigned a brand new jacket for this using original techniques. And I don't know if you can really tell on here, this is like a burlap textured jacket, the kind you would get on these old like RCA Soraya series jackets. It's really kind of astounding to hold because it feels like you're holding something very old. It doesn't feel like any record jackets I'm familiar with now, but in reality, it's brand new. It was probably more or less assembled by hand, considering the French record company only made 200 of these records. Only 200 of these exist. They only pressed 200, and complete with there was no original liner notes for this release. There would have been liner notes had it been released. So Jean-Marc commissioned a very well-known musicologist to do interior jacket liner notes for this release in French. I wish I could. I wish there was an English version available, and I did talk to Jean-Marc about that, and that's something he may include in future releases. But it's just this. It feels like this beautiful step back in time, holding this record. But I want to talk a little bit about what makes this recording so special, because in talking to Jean-Marc, his idea for this label is that he is going to be reissuing primarily unreleased recordings that were made and never saw the light of day, much like some of the Blue Note tone poets that are coming out, that were records that were prepared, that were just shelved. And it is going to be of primarily French artists, particularly French music of the 20th century. So French artists, maybe these were recording artists that were popular in France but didn't necessarily have worldwide appeal, and I think Marcelle Meyer is a good example of that. But and so this label has a really defined laser focus, and that's what I want to stress in here. It's something that is unique of a time and place, and is kind of introducing to the world. His idea is that he's introducing to the world, to the collectible community, these French artists that may not have been household names the way some other international classical artists were. And that's kind of the gist I get of what Jean-Marc is going for with this label. So to talk a little bit about the artist on this record is a French artist, a woman named Marcelle Meyer. And Marcelle Meyer is a really, really interesting pianist that I was hitherto completely unaware of. I did not know anything about her. And the more I read about her, the more I realized what an extraordinary artist and musician she was, and how it's kind of interesting that we don't really think about her much in regards to French music today. But she has some connections to French music of the 20th century that are just incredible. When Marcelle was 20 years old in 1917, she was already a performing concert pianist, and she gave the premiere of Erik Satie's Parade, which involved a number of important artists in French music, Pablo Picasso, Jean Cocteau, Sergei Diaghilev of the Ballet Russe. And she developed a strong artistic professional relationship with Erik Satie. And through that, she met Claude Debussy. In the last year of his life, Debussy actually gave coachings to Marcelle Meyer on his music. And so to have a document of piano playing like this from Marcelle Meyer by an artist who was coached personally by the composer, is really, really interesting. And that's one reason I really love these classical recordings of the 50s and the 60s, because we were just now getting to high fidelity recording. We were just now getting to that we could capture artists in a high fidelity medium that actually sounded somewhat realistic. But there were still artists alive that were that had worked with a lot of the famous composers of the late 19th and early 20th century. If you look at, like, for instance, the conductor Bruno Walter, you had in the 50s and the 60s Bruno Walter recording Beethoven and recording Mahler. Now, he never, he's far too young to have met Beethoven, but Bruno Walter worked with Mahler. Bruno Walter also, Fritz Reiner, who was a personal friend of Bela Bartok. And that's something that recordings from this era can capture that we don't get today. We don't get that direct connection anymore. So that makes this recording very interesting to me. Meyer is probably most famous for being kind of an unofficial pianist of a group of French composers called Les Six, the Six. This included Georges Auric, Louis Duret, Arthur Honegger, Darius Milhaud, Francis Poulenc, and Germain Taillefer. I don't know if I'm saying Taillefer's name correctly because he's not one of the more famous Les Six composers, but I mean, the three big ones in there, of course, are Honegger, Milhaud, and Poulenc, who, are composers that are played widely to this day. Les Six were a group of French composers active kind of in the early 20th century, kind of pre-World War II, a little bit post-World War II, that were actually a reaction to French Impressionism. And it's very interesting that Meyer was close friends with these musicians, these composers, but also with Ravel and Debussy, who were Impressionists. She floated among musical circles. She was also friends with Igor Stravinsky, and she nurtured all these relationships with all these artists who had very bitter rivalries in some cases. Now, I did find out something about Marcelle Meyer in researching this that may explain why she's less well-known today, or at least less well-known in the second half of the 20th century. Her reputation seemed to really sour in World War II, and there's not a lot of concrete information I could find about this, but it seemed to... this was a common problem with musicians working in Europe in World War II, is... accusations of collaboration with the fascist regime, both in Germany. You had a lot of conductors and composers that fled Germany and some that continued working in Germany, and that had various effects on their career. You had musicians like Wilhelm Furtwängler and Richard Strauss that stayed and continued working under Nazi Germany, whereas other composers like Paul Hindemith, who fled to America, Toscanini, the Italian that fled to the United States. And the same was true in occupied France. You had lots of musicians who would not collaborate with Nazi organizations, musical organizations, and some that would. And it seems like, at least in some instances, Marcelle Meyer did give concerts with visiting occupation German orchestras, and that seemed to have soured her in some musical circles and made her less popular. Although, like I said, the details are kind of blurry. I was able to find a quote by Francis Poulenc that suggested that Meyer's second husband, her Italian husband, had profited from stolen Jewish belongings during the war, and I couldn't find anything about that other than that quote from Poulenc. So I have no idea if that's true. It's just the interesting things I was reading about this pianist. The later half of her life, post World War II, she developed pretty much a lot of her time to recording, and she was working with the French record producer André Charlin. And André Charlin was a very important figure in recorded music in France because, in Europe in general, he produced the first European microgroove recording in 1945, the first microgroove LP he was the producer on. And in the mid-50s, he was working with a label, Discophile Français, and that was where Meyer did a lot of her solo piano recordings. She was one of the first French pianists to record the complete keyboard works, I believe, of François Couperin and a number of other artists. She was very prolific at this period of her life. Somewhat ironically, I guess, she passed away in 1958 when this record was supposed to be released. At the age of 61, she had a heart attack while at the piano. Very, very tragic. She was actually in the planning stages of her first North American tour. She had been invited by the former conductor of the New York Philharmonic, Dimitri Mitropoulos, to come play in the United States, and she was getting ready for that when she passed away. It seems like, for people that know, Marcelle Meyer was a very, very, very important hidden gem of a pianist. If you go online and look up her, it's everyone talking about how no one knows about Marcelle Meyer, but they should, because her playing is very special. Not only did she have intimate professional relationships, intimate friendships with a lot of the leading French composers of the early 20th century, but her playing style is very much in the vein of that pre-World War II French style that is kind of more or less lost today. Listening to her version of the Debussy preludes, which I'd never heard before, I hear them in a completely different way listening to this recording. There is I don't want to say simplicity, but there is a pure clarity in the way she plays. It's very, very different from a lot of the standard versions of this music that I've heard before. Let me talk a little bit about the music that's on here, and that's the 2 books of Debussy preludes, the piano preludes. Piano preludes are kind of an older, long-established genre in keyboard music, but Debussy had a very unique take on the preludes. Oftentimes when Bach or other composers, whether it be from the Baroque to the Classical to the Romantic era, would write preludes, there would be these short piano pieces that were centered on a specific key. Well, Debussy's preludes were not key-specific. They wandered in their tonality. And they're very distinctive of Debussy's impressionistic style. And what do I mean when I say impressionist? Impressionism to Debussy, and Debussy was kind of the originator of musical impressionism. What I mean when I say that is it's music that is designed to evoke not necessarily a specific thing, but maybe a specific image and maybe a feeling associated with that image. In painting, painting and impressionism is a little bit older than musical impressionism. But painting and impressionism, if you look at the paintings of Claude Monet or other similar late 19th century painters, you see what they were doing with painting was distorting the image of whatever they were painting, whether it be a field or a street or a scene, and they were changing what you viewed as the viewer so that you, instead of capturing the thing, you were capturing more of the feeling or the emotion of the image. That may mean slightly smearing the people in the painting to invoke the idea of wind sweeping across them. Almost the idea of making an image more blurry to make it more realistic of what you would see, on a hot summer day in the French countryside. You would see an image that was clouded in many ways by the light, by the things around you, by the wind, by the rain. Those things would affect how you viewed the image. And that's what the Impressionist painters were doing. They were trying to capture the feeling around a scene, not just the actual objects in the scene. And in some ways, musical impressionism is similar, and in some ways it's different. I mean, because music does not purely capture an image, so Debussy doesn't have to distort the image. More what the music is doing is invoking the feeling of a scene, the feeling of a thing, the feeling of a place, to try to input a mood to the listener of what that thing or what that place might be like if you were there. Each of these preludes has a subtitle in it, and it's to invoke an image to the listener, such as one is footsteps in the snow. Another one is the sunken cathedral. And Debussy would use his music to try to invoke what those things would feel like to witness or to be a part of. If that makes any sense at all. There's a lot of trademark Debussy-isms in this writing, and if I were to introduce someone to Debussy, I think the piano preludes are a really great place to start. One of the really important things that Debussy was doing in his compositions was the introduction of parallel fifths and parallel octaves in the writing. And if you've ever taken a basic counterpoint or composition class, you would know that one of the things you avoid in harmonic part writing, and that has always been avoided in composition, is parallel motion of fifths, so fifth scale degree chords, and parallel motion of octaves, moving in parallel motion. So, you know, a low C and a high C moving up and down together. You don't want that parallel motion traditionally, but Debussy found a way to incorporate it, and he was able to create very unique sounds using these compositional techniques. And so if you really are interested in what makes Debussy's Impressionism sound so different than all music that came before it, you can listen for those in these piano preludes, and they're very easy to hear. Meyer's playing on this recording is very, very different from the style of Debussy piano playing that I'm kind of used to hearing. For the longest time, my two go-to recordings of these piano preludes, well, the first has been one that was recorded around the same time in mono, and that is of the German pianist Walter Gieseking. This is a great early 80s EMI, French EMI reissue of the complete piano works of Debussy with Walter Gieseking. And I think these recordings are fantastic, but they are played very differently from Meyer's playing. This is a very romantic interpretation of Debussy, and I'm not going to say that one is better than the other. It's like different flavors of ice cream, but there's some argument to the idea that Meyer's playing on this recording is significantly more true to probably what Debussy was intending, which was a less embellished in terms of time and less embellished in terms of expression. Because there's so much expression in the music as it is, you don't need to add a lot of salt and pepper. You don't need to add a lot of extra flavors to it. The music is very, very good as the composer wrote it. And so what Meyer does when she plays, it's incredible, beautiful simplicity, but super, super nuanced, super attention to detail. She does so many little things in her playing that are not these big grand gestures like in the Gieseking, or even like in another recording of the preludes I really love, which is Michelangeli. This is my esoteric essay CD of Michelangeli playing the Debussy preludes. There's not so much of that, and it's really subtle nuances, but because of that, the music has this incredible flow to it that is unencumbered, and it's almost like letting the music breathe and show itself clearly. And you couple that with a really astounding technique. I was listening to, one of my favorites is Prelude number 7 from Book 2, which is the Terrace of Moonlight Audiences. And Meyer has these incredible rapid fire chords in the climax of the prelude. And she does it so easily. She has this incredible technique and just rattles off these complex passages very smoothly without a lot of fuss. You know, it's not like listening to some of the other pianists, like a modern example would be Lang Lang, where it's so heavy and labored. And no, it's so fluid and natural. Listening to her play this, it's musically astounding. And I think even if this record doesn't interest you, it's worth going out and finding this music on streaming or on CD or something like that, because it might now be my favorite rendition of the Debussy preludes. But I do want to talk a little bit about the main reason why I'm talking about this record today, and that it's kind of relation to an audiophile or a boutique record product. That's kind of what my channel is about. As I said before, this recording was never issued. Discophile Français had the tapes, which now are owned by Warner, and Jean-Marc was able to secure access to the original master tapes from this recording. They were owned by Warner. He has a good relationship with Warner in Europe. Got the tapes, shipped them to New York, where this record was mastered and cut by Carl Rawati at True Tone Mastering in New York. And then the lacquers were plated at Quality Record Pressing in Salida, Kansas, and then sent back to Germany to be pressed at Paulus. And now I can talk a little bit about the sound on this reissue. When you are listening to a record that you know is $600, I'm not sure that any expectation you have can really be met. Because in my opinion, this is not an audiophile showstopper. This is a very pretty original mono recording. And it reminds me in some ways of a very recent mono reissue and that's Heifetz's The Lark, another mono mid-50s recording that was just reissued by Impex. And this is a $40 record, not a $600 record, $650 record. And this sounds excellent, but it does sound of its time. There's a little bit of hollowness in the mono sound on this, particularly in the piano. Piano is very, very difficult to record. The violin sounds fantastic, but the piano does have a little bit of that, kind of back of the, recorded with one mic, so it was a little bit further back, and it does have a little bit of that, I don't want to say missing body, but a slightly colored body that lets you know it was recorded in the mid-50s. And there's a little bit of that in this recording as well. But there's also some things that I don't hear in The Lark that I hear in this that impressed me. One of that is the high frequency detail. The overtones of the piano sounded gorgeous on this. It's a very beautiful recording to listen to. But there are issues, and some of those issues are because of the route that the French record company decided to take in the process of reissuing this. And it was really a pure transfer from the original master tape as much as possible. No, not even a digital delay in the signal, all analog signal. I have written down the equipment that they used in making this. Carl Wawadi at True Tone Mastering used a Studer A80 preview machine, full analog preview, no digital delay. It was mastered on a Neumann SP77 console and a Neumann SAL74B cutting amplifier. And he used a 1957 Fairchild 670 tube compressor and a Pultec EM-H7 tube equalizer. And they noted in the promotional materials on this website, both those, the Fairchild and the Pultec tube equipment, there's like 3 or 4 of them in the world. So there's a lot of care in getting this from the master tape to the record. But because of the kind of pure thought process they were taking, there are some noticeable things that I listened to in this. For instance, I was talking with Jean-Marc, and he admitted the first LP, the first side, the tapes were not in great shape. And you hear that. You hear the flaws in the tape on this. There are some dropouts. There are some issues that you hear all the flaws of a tape that hasn't been played in 60 years. It was just sitting there in God knows what condition. And I'm sure that if this was taken to something like the plangent process, those issues would be solved. But and that might produce, in some regards, a better or cleaner sounding record. But I don't think that's what the French record company wants to do. I think they want to present kind of this facsimile documented product of this is the archival version. And so I see the pros and cons of that. And I'm able to appreciate this recording even with some of the sonic flaws that are on the tape. I'm able to appreciate it for what it is, which is a beautiful lost recording that no one has gotten to hear in this way, in this regard, the way it was intended to be originally, with this beautiful original jacket that was supposed to have existed and it didn't for whatever reason. I think there's beauty to that. Is it for me? I really enjoyed listening to it. I think it's special. I don't think I would pay $600 for a record like this, but I don't know if I'm the target for this necessarily. They only made 200 of these. And I think the target is people that want this archival piece of history in this way. It's more than just the sound coming out of the speakers, although that's important too. It's this document, this tribute to a recording that never got its due deserve at the time that it was made, that was not released and shelved, and the performer passed away, and it was just kind of lost to time. And it's been recreated now. It's like resurrecting the Titanic. In fact, it's very much like that. It reminds me of like this idea of like doing a replica of the Titanic, where, well, yeah, there are better ships sailing now with more technology, with more safety features, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's this beautiful original document. You can't necessarily explain why you're drawn to it, but you are. And so I don't know if I can give you a verdict on a review like this, because it's just such a unique product, and I think it does offer something very unique, even from the other label that's doing records priced at this kind of price, which is Electric Recording Company. I think this is more special than the Electric Recording Company. I really do. And if it's something that interests you, by all means, you can still buy them. Jean-Marc clearly did not intend to make a profit on this. He made 200 of these. I don't know if that's even covering the costs that went into making this. It's kind of a labor of love, and I definitely see it that way. So this is very different from like the normal classical either reissues or original pressings that I've reviewed, because those I'm very much reviewing at like this is the sound quality you get at this cost, whereas this you're paying for things that aren't just the sound quality. So I really thank Jean-Marc for giving me the time to talk about his interesting project and his record label with him, and I'm super thankful to Danny Kaye for sending this to me, get my thoughts on it. It's a really special record of a pianist that I think is woefully underappreciated. So if you get anything out of this review, please go look up Marcelle Meyer. I think she's a fascinating artist that definitely deserves more ears on her recorded output, for sure. This was the first release from the French record company, and they are working on another release that is supposed to be out at the end of this year. And that is a release of the French violinist Michel Auclair. And this one is going to be a stereo record. It's a stereo recital record, and in keeping with the themes of the French record company, this is a release of a unissued recording, a recording that never saw the light of day. And I think as long as the French record company sticks to kind of unearthing these forgotten records in such an archival way, I think they found a really interesting and important niche. Even if it might not be for everyone, I think it's really cool what they're doing, and I have to say I'm impressed with all the work that went into such a small release of just a few records. As long as I'm here, I thought I'd talk about a little something new that has found its way into my system permanently, and that's a streamer. So a couple weeks ago, I reviewed a streamer by the British Portuguese brand Inuos. And that review can be found over on the Absolute Sounds YouTube channel. I'll provide a link or a picture or something, and you'll be able to go find that. So I reviewed the Inuos Zen Mini, and I was really impressed with that. And at the end of the review, I was interested in purchasing an Inuos streamer because I enjoyed it so much. And Inuos was able to hook me up with an old demo unit of one of their top-of-the-line streamers, and that is the Zenith Mark III. So I now have a pretty intense digital front end here. This is a really, really cool, amazing sounding streamer. I didn't think a streamer could really raise the playback of the digital side of my system that well. This thing is extraordinary. If you want to see my thoughts on the Zen Mini, again, go watch the Zen Mini review. This I've put a few hours on so far, and it's been very impressive. So it's probably going to be a permanent part of the system. I just wanted to share that because I don't talk about digital a lot on this channel, but this is one digital piece that I like a lot. So I hope you enjoyed hearing me talk about kind of a silly, expensive, crazy niche record for a little bit of that, because not everyone gets to hear something like that, and I'm very lucky that I did. And I know that's something that most people that watch my channel aren't in the market for, but it's so unique, I figured I had to do something, and I'm very lucky to have heard something like this, because again, there's only 200 in the world. So thanks, Jean-Marc, thanks, Danny, and until next time, cheers.